Meredith. I'm Roy Hensel, and I guess you might say I'm a history nut, and it seems like I've become a cemetery nut lately too. But I've done the past 2 years an Oak Grove Cemetery tour with the Market House Theater, which again we're doing tomorrow night and Friday night, and that got me interested in the folks that are buried in Oak Grove and the interesting stories they have. So I just collected in the last 2 years many different people's stories that I think you might be interested in. So many people think that a cemetery is a dead place, but after this presentation, I hope that you'll find it a place living with great stories. Now, I've renamed this the near famous, infamous, and interesting residents of Oak Grove Cemetery, as some of these people and their stories were famous or even infamous in their day. Most Paducans have heard of several of the famous locally known people in Oak Grove, such as Irvin Cobb, author, actor, humorist, favorite son of the city; Lynn Boyd, statesman, who was almost vice president, helped Andrew Jackson with the Jackson Purchase, and was instrumental in trying to prevent the Civil War, as was Henry Clay; and John Scopes, who became entangled in one of the most controversial trials of the early 20th century. But I intend to tell you the stories of some you may have never heard of before, but I think nonetheless you'll be fascinated with their stories. So let's get started with the first one. If you like stories of the Old West, manifest destiny, gunslingers, showdowns, shootouts, then the story of Evatt Dumas Nix, better known as Colonel E.D. Nix, should interest you. Colonel Nix was born and raised in Callaway County. He came from a family of law enforcement officers. His uncle was the county sheriff. His father was the deputy sheriff. As a young man, he worked in his father's factory and later operated a grocery store business in Coldwater. He became a traveling salesman and representative and moved to Paducah in 1885. In 1889, he and his wife, who had been his childhood sweetheart, moved to the Oklahoma Territory during the Oklahoma Land Run to claim their spot to Oklahoma. Making a name for himself there as a man of integrity, in 1893, President Grover Cleveland appointed him as the first and youngest U.S. Marshal in the Oklahoma Territory. He was just 32. Criminals, cattle thieves, bank robbers, counterfeiters, stagecoach and train robbers created a lawless and dangerous place in the territory. The Dalton and Doolin gangs were in full swing. Marshal Nix was told by the territorial Supreme Court judge that, quote, "The only good outlaw is a dead outlaw. Instruct your deputies to bring in dead outlaws. This will simplify your problem and save lives," unquote. Well, Marshal Nix wasted no time in moving and bringing together a posse, bringing the gangs down. He organized a posse of 27 men to take the outlaws at Ingalls, Oklahoma, in a gunfight where several were killed. Many Western historians consider this the most deadliest gun battle between outlaws and U.S. Marshals in the history of the Southwest. During his 3 years as U.S. Marshal, Nix and his deputies killed 47 outlaws and made hundreds of arrests, according to the U.S. Marshal Service. Nix carried with him a portable scaffold in his travels in 1894. Colonel Nix told the stories of this time in his book called Okla Hombres, particularly the wilder ones, which detailed his work of bringing down the gangs. He even starred in a 1914 silent film entitled The Passing of the Oklahoma Outlaws. Nix's other big claim to fame was that he was the one who fired the shot that opened the great land races and claims for the Cherokee Strip Land Run in 1893. Colonel Nix died in California, but is buried in Oak Grove, right here in Paducah. When Colonel Nix would come to Paducah to visit his brother and sister, he would often leave the local children spellbound with his stories of the Old West. Imagine hearing these stories as a child from an authentic Wild West lawman. I heard about him from one of these people just last year. Now, this is perhaps the saddest and most horrific story of a resident of Paducah, Mary Fletcher Brockwell. She and her husband had four daughters, Hazel, Lucy, Ola, and Lily. In 1904, her husband was sent to the asylum for the insane in Hopkinsville. With no means of support, Mary took in washing and boarders. One boarder, George Albritton, who was 21, lived with her, as he put it, quote, as I would a wife, but I'm not the only person who did, unquote. The family lived at 337 Ashbrook Avenue when George left Mary, which took a toll on her, as she thought, and maybe it was in her own mind, that he was going to marry her, even though she was still married. She claimed that he told her that he would marry her if she got rid of the children. With George gone, her father-in-law threatening her, and the strain of supporting her children, Mary did the unthinkable. On March 24th, 1905, she put morphine in the children's cabbage and poisoned her children. Lucy, who was 9, Ola, 4, and Lily, 3. 14 agonizing hours later, all 3 were dead. Hazel survived, as she would not eat the foul-tasting meal. Mary stated, quote, I gave them morphine, and after they began coughing, I secured some coal oil to ease their throats, unquote. While in jail, more than 3,000 people passed through to get a look at the murderess, paying 5 cents admission. The bodies were on exhibition at the funeral home, but due to the amount of visitors, that stopped the day before the funeral. The funeral cortege to Oak Grove stretched a mile long. Thousands entered Oak Grove, the largest funeral up to that time. So many came that graves were trampled upon and thousands of dollars worth of damage. The money raised by the town for the funeral and other expenses went to repair the graves. The 3 girls were placed in an unmarked grave as there was no money for a gravestone. Mrs. Brockwell attended the funeral at Broadway Methodist Church, as well as the burial. A large crowd ran after her carriage, trying to get a glimpse of the murderess. She received a life sentence and was sent to the state penitentiary in Frankfort, but was released only 12 years later for good behavior and a complete reformation. The graves remained unmarked for 114 years, until last year, when a GoFundMe post, as well as money received from the sale of a book about the incident, raised enough money for the marker. What could lead a mother to do such a thing? What went through her mind? Eventually, Mary went down to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where Hazel was still living. I can't believe that Hazel would have welcomed her. But even Hazel tragically died at only 37 years old. A tragic story for 4 little girls from Paducah. Now, the name of Rodney Richie, who was 5 years old, is probably well known with members of Broadway Methodist Church in Paducah, but many others, like myself, have never heard of this lad's unselfish love for his church. He went to the church's school when he was only 5, back in 1895. It was during that time that the church was in discussion of erecting a new church on the northwest corner of 7th and Broadway. It would be a diagonal move across the street from where the church had been, on the southeast corner of 7th and Broadway, where Curtis and Mays was located. In fact, the back of that building still contains part of the original church. Little Rodney overheard these discussions of needing a new church and wanted to do something to help his church. The only worldly possession he owned was his little pet canary. He immediately went home and sold his bird for the sum of $1. He took that dollar and brought it to the minister of the church as his contribution towards the building of the new church. The minister told of Rodney's unselfish deed to the church, and which some say was actually the first money raised by anyone in the church for that effort. Soon, Sunday school classes joined in the cause by creating a fund they called the Rodney Richie Fund. Soon, The funds were raised to begin the construction of the church, which on the cornerstone, it reads it was built in 1895. Within a short time after Rodney's act of unselfishness, the poor boy was struck down by a streetcar and killed. The church felt a memorial was necessary and needed to dedicate to this boy. A beautiful stained glass window was designed and placed in the church near the entrance on 7th Street in his honor. The bottom of the window says, "In memory of Master Rodney Richie." And emblazoned across the middle, it reads, very appropriately, "Suffer little children to come unto me." But the most striking feature is what was placed on top of the window, a beautiful bird perched on a branch, peacefully looking skyward to represent his canary. Fire broke out in the new church some 34 years later, destroying most of the interior, including all of the stained glass windows. That is, with one exception. Rodney Richie's window remained unscathed. The stained glass window is still in its place today as a reminder to all of us that if a 5-year-old boy could make a difference in a short lifespan, so can we. You can see it from 7th Street. Now, Rodney's place in Oak Grove remained a mystery until last year when the cemetery sexton, along with my research, searched an empty family plot to find 14 family members buried there, and after digging down about 4 inches, found a stone which had simply been engraved on it, Rodney. Now here's an infamous story of the 1930s, which rocked the headlines around the country. Willie DeBeau Jr. from Paducah has the distinction of being the last man legally hung in Kentucky. He, along with an accomplice, robbed 2 stores in Livingston County in 1934 and assaulted the wives of the owners. They fled to the Memphis area and continued with more robberies and assaults. At first, after being captured, he was charged with robbery and assault. But after a few months, one of the women from Livingston County claimed he had raped her. Now, back in 1935, in Kentucky, rape carried a sentence of hanging. DeBeau went to the gallows, admitting for the robberies, but denied the rape charge. He was hung on Good Friday, April 19th, 1935. In a 45-minute speech from the gallows before he hung, he said that the woman accuser was putting to death an innocent man. 1,500 people attended the hanging in Smithland, but only a few days later, more than 4,000 gathered at Oak Grove for the burial. After reading many articles in the 1930s Paducah papers and others, I'm not quite sure he got a fair trial, and his guilt is questionable. Many in his day supported his innocence, as to account for many of the supporters who attended his funeral and burial. Of course, they also could have been just curious. Did you know how it said they're just dying to get there? Well, Tom and Dolly were that way about getting into Oak Grove Cemetery. They were determined and stubborn as a mule. As a matter of fact, they were mules, both of them, and they're both buried in Oak Grove Cemetery. Now, not much, if anything, is known about Tom the Mule. It is thought that he may have pulled wagons for the fire department, but Dolly the Mule has made quite a name for herself. Born in Marshall County about the time of the Civil War was ending, she was brought to be used by the fire department in Paducah to service on the hose carriage. For 16 years, she faithfully did her job, knowing where every cistern was to get water. Modern times came and the mules were replaced with horses for more power. And in 1881, Dolly was out of a job. It was suggested that she go to the City of the Dead for hauling instead of being left to die in the commons. For an additional 16 years, Dolly faithfully pulled her load in the cemetery. But you can't teach an old mule, new tricks. And when the fire alarm would go off, Dolly heard it in the cemetery, she would race up and down the avenues there unless, quote, prevented by sheer force, unquote, as an article in 1897 paper said. When she died, as an 1897 article put it, the dim light at last burned low, and yesterday it went out entirely. She was replaced by the horse Prince, who ironically was the animal who replaced her in the fire department. She was called an animal as faithful as she was perennial. She had an exception made for her in the cemetery's ordinance, allowing her to be buried at Oak Grove. The paper said she, quote, was more fortunate than many of her human contemporaries, for she escaped Potter's Field, unquote. Now, let's advance 101 years later. In 1998, after going on a living history tour of the cemetery, students from McNabb Elementary wanted to know where Dolly was buried and why she didn't have a tombstone like Tom. They decided to start a campaign for her tombstone, and they called it Pennies for Dolly. And in December of 1998, after collecting $360, with an additional $140 from the other 3 city elementary schools, 50 students walked over from McNabb to witness the placement of Dolly's monument. Now, for the past 2 years, I have portrayed Dr. Reuben Saunders, the grandfather of Irvin Cobb, and discoverer of the cure of cholera. This is the Market House Theater's annual Oak Grove tour during the Halloween season, where his story is told from his burial plot. While I was hiding behind a cedar tree, waiting to surprise the next group, I heard an animal whinny and looked around the dark, but there was no animal, no horse, no mule. I found out later the story of Tom and that he was buried right behind me where I would lay in wait for the group. Need I tell you the hair on the back of my neck stood up? Welcome to Oak Grove, where you never know who you'll chance upon or experience. Now, one of the most touching monuments in Oak Grove is made of granite, about 4 feet square at the base and about 9 feet high, surmounted by a draped urn. The inscriptions are as follows. On the north side, Henry Shelton, colored, drowned, as it says, July 1st, 1889, age 43 years, lost his life in the effort to save the life of a white child. On the west side, in commemoration of his heroic death, this monument was erected by the white citizens of Paducah. On the south side, no greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friend. And on the north side, inasmuch as you have done unto me of the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me. The heroic act which inspired this monument occurred on the morning of July 1st, 1889. Henry Shelton was a fireman on the steamer Gus Fowler. Now, an Italian family had boarded at Cairo, and when they reached near Brookport, their 2-year-old son tripped and fell overboard. Shelton, an expert swimmer, without a moment's hesitation, jumped into the river and caught the child in his arms. But the current was too strong, and he strained himself in the jump. Lines were thrown out as they were sucked under the boat and drowned. A diver recovered Shelton's body, but not the boy's, which was never recovered. A fund was immediately raised for the by the white people of Paducah for burial. Shelton's funeral was largely attended by both black and white people. 44 years later, in honor of Emancipation Day, an editorial appeared in the Paducah Sun, simply signed a white Democrat. It stated, "The colored people of the nation have contributed many worthy and even noble characters to its citizenship, such as Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Lawrence Dunbar, Sojourner Truth, and others. But there is no name in their roll of honor which should stand higher than that of Henry Shelton, who gave his life in an effort to save the life of a humble child." 4 days later, another letter to the editor appeared, written by Pastor T.J. Smith of the Washington Street Baptist Church, in response to and praising the first letter. He stated in part, "It serves notice to us that there are many white people who recognize men by their character rather than their color. For a man can develop his character, but cannot change his color." This quote was 30 years, almost to the day, before Martin Luther King said in his famous I Have a Dream speech, I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the context of their character. In Oak Grove, there is a monument with but one piece of information on it to offer the identity of the lady there. Edna. No last name, no birth date, just Edna. The date indicates that she died in 1907. But who was this lady? The clue is the only other inscription. To her memory, the Phantasma Company. Did a lot of research on this. It was very hard, but I cracked the case. Edna was born Edna Richmond to an actress mother and an English father. While performing in England, her mother met her father. Edna, in true show business tradition, was born in a trunk, although it was actually on the acting troupe's railroad car, or as her obituary states, quote, born on the cars somewhere in New York on the way to Lexington, unquote. A sister took charge of her when Edna was young and trained her for the stage. As she grew up, she adopted the stage name Edna Farrell. She traveled throughout the world on her tours, including 3 times to Australia. When her acting troupe, the Phantasma Company, came to Paducah to perform, she met William Malone, who managed the theater at LaBelle Park, later named Wallace Park. They married in 1901. They lived in Paducah a few years before Mr. Malone became sick. Edna went back on the road in early 1907. She had played for years the lead in Phantasma productions as Phantasma. While on this tour, she became ill in Nashville with the grip. She traveled with the company to Chattanooga, where she was hospitalized. Her husband traveled to her side. She died there. Her body was returned to Paducah, but the mystery still lies in why the acting troupe erected her monument. Mr. Malone was appointed superintendent of Wallace Park and later management for the Sunny Side of Broadway acting troupe. But why is he not buried with her? Why is Edna's last name, either her real or stage name, not on there also? As I said at the beginning, the mysterious Edna. Fate Marable was born in Paducah in 1890. His mother was a piano teacher, and when she heard Fate pecking at the keys, she thought it was time to give him lessons in reading music and playing piano. At 17, he was shining shoes in Paducah, yet he had this unique talent which made, quote, the keys jump under his fingers, unquote. His first musical job started when he began playing in 1907 on steamboats on the Mississippi River. There was a catch to his first musical employment, however. One of his responsibilities would be to play the large steam calliope. Steam would stream through the brass pipes and whistles at 80 pounds of pressure. The keys were hot and hard to hold down, and the volume overwhelming. So Marable wore gloves, stuffed his ears with cotton, and wore rain gear. Within a short time, he became a band leader of the line, which ran from New Orleans to St. Paul. He held that position for 33 years, until 1940, mostly playing on board the SS Capitol. He became a legendary as well as historical figure in riverboat jazz. His band became the first African-American organization to play on the excursion boats. Marable was a strict band leader. Many of his band members played by ear, so he taught them to read music and expected them all to learn to play sheet music on sight, but allowed them to develop their own individual strong points. He boosted many of his musicians' careers, such as Cab Calloway, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, and Fax Waller. Now, he scouted in New Orleans for talent and discovered a teenager blowing a cornet and recruited him. He was named Louis David Armstrong, and this was Louis's first big break. He was also taught to sight read music, and Armstrong described his time with Marable as going to the university. Going to the university, as he probably would have said, since it gave him a wider experience working with written arrangements. Armstrong switched to playing the trumpet, and Marable called this sweet-lipped kid of 18 his satchel-mouthed trumpeter. Well, Armstrong was nicknamed Satchmo and worked with Marable's band from 1918 to 1921 as he developed his craft. Ironically, Armstrong, when traveling through the Paducah area on the Chitlin Circuit, as it was called, stayed at the Hotel Metropolitan, which is just a stone's throw from the site where Marable was born. By 1921, Marable's band was considered the best dance band in the United States. In 1924, the Cotton Pickers, which was the name of the band, later became the Society Syncopators, made their first and unfortunately only record, Frankie and Johnny. By 1940, Marable was working at many different clubs in the St. Louis area with a band and solo. He became sick and died in 1947 at age 56. His body was brought back to Paducah for burial in Oak Grove Cemetery, but he left a great legacy of a new kind of music. The music world is greatly indebted to this son of Paducah. By the way, that little monument is what caught my eye and got me interested in him. Very interesting monument there. Of all the residents of Oak Grove, Robert and Martha Kreider have probably the most interesting and unique gravestone. Oh, not because it's the oldest or largest or most expensive. It is a government tombstone reserved for veterans with this very simple stone, but the words written on it, as well as the dates, make it very interesting. Robert was born around 1802 and Martha about 1793, according to their ages on their stones. The USCHA on his stone, and the 8 there, signifies that he was part of the 8th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. The Battle of Paducah took place on Good Friday, March 25, 1864, between the Union Army, led by Colonel Hicks, and the Confederates under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Fort Anderson in Paducah was defended by the 40th Illinois and by Major George Barnes' 16th Kentucky, along with the newly formed African-American group, the 8th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. Barnes, by the way, was given the order to torch Lowertown, and coincidentally was the father of Della Barnes, another subject of our Oak Grove story. The 8th USCHA impressed Colonel Hicks, who had doubted them at first. So impressed, he compared their conduct favorably to the best troops he had ever fought with during the war. And in an article in the New York Tribune, he wrote, quote, "They were in front, 220 in all, and fought with great gallantry," unquote. The USCHA inspired Robert Kreider and his 3 sons, Samuel, Isaac, and Gideon, to travel to Paducah from Caldwell County the day after the battle and sign up to be part of this troop. Now, Robert's enlistment papers state that he was 44, but if his stone is accurate, he was really 62. It would have been common to change your age to join. Some changed it younger, some changed it older. Reports about Robert's son Samuel explain that he was murdered in company headquarters in Mayfield. Another states that he was killed by violence in Mayfield. The burial spot of Samuel is unknown. Robert's other sons who enlisted are buried in Metropolis. In Oak Grove, I located 2 more members, actually 4 more members, but 2 more members of the USCHA, Scott Woolfork and George Watson. Also at rest at Oak Grove are Corporal Richard Archer of the 28th Colored Infantry and Sergeant James Bell of the 16th Colored Infantry. And I'm sure there are more to be discovered, for in Metropolis, I found another member of the 8th, which was named as Riley Lyons. Now, back to Robert and Martha Kreider. The significance of their stones exhibit that they are the oldest couple buried in Oak Grove. At an age where the average age of a male was 46 and a female 48, they lived to a remarkable amount of years. Robert died at 105 and Martha at 115. a remarkable feat in any time period, but especially in the early 1900s. Born in Virginia in 1758, Charles Yule is the only Revolutionary War veteran buried at Oak Grove. He joined the Continental Army at age 17, right after Lexington and Concord. He raised in the ranks quickly. At age 19, he became a second lieutenant, and the next year, a captain by age 20. By 1780, at age 22, he was commissioned a major by Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia. After the war, he was granted 3,000 acres in Kentucky for his service. At that time, Kentucky was still a county in Virginia and wouldn't become a state until 1792. He did not, however, get the land promised and petitioned Congress for many years, finally getting the acreage promised in 1826, 30 years after the original grant. Yule was now 68 years old. Records show that he was also a participant in the War of 1812 when he was in his 50s. He was also actively engaged in the battle at the White House, where the British invaded Washington, D.C. and burned that building, as well as other major government buildings. After fighting in 2 wars, he finally received the land he was promised, which was in the now newly formed McCracken County. That same year, he, along with his wife, his son's widow, and her 4 children, crossed over the Cumberland Gap in a covered wagon to make the trek to his promised land, arriving in McCracken County on December 5th, 1826. He was only to live less than 4 years on this land, dying in 1830 at age 72. In 1842, Ballard County was formed from McCracken County, and so most of his land became part of Ballard. His wife, Maria, lived her life out until 1863, dying in Wilmington. It is said that he lived for a while on North 6th Street. When Major Yule died, he was buried in the cemetery, in the city cemetery, which was located on land where City Hall is now today, as many were. In 1847, the city purchased land for the city cemetery and named it Oak Grove. And at that time, his body was reinterred and transferred to that location, as were many other bodies buried on the South 4th Street location. So, McCracken County has a heritage going back to the Revolutionary War and a great patriot. At 19 years old, in 1822, Valentine Owen left Louisville by himself in a solitary canoe on the Ohio River. Everything along the river then was wild, with few towns. The banks were lined with dense forests, teeming with bears, wolves, and panthers. He arrived at a place which is now located at the foot of Broadway, in a little clearing of the fledgling village known as Pekin. The village, 5 years later, would be renamed Paducah. Pekin had a population of about 25, with a few scattered cabins. 6 years later, a young girl named Elizabeth Walters would come by boat there with her father, her mother, and her sisters. Mr. Walters brought stock with them to start a store. She and her sisters played a game shortly before they docked called Foretelling the Future. And on her turn, the answer foretold her that the first man to walk on the gangplank to the boat, she would marry. As fate would have it, as they say, Valentine welcomed the boat. Many years after he and Elizabeth married, Valentine heard about this prophecy from her. Isn't this really truly a Valentine story? They had 10 children. Her sister, considered the belle of Kentucky, married another Paducah pioneer, Braxton Small, who became the first McCracken County court clerk. Their marriage would become the first recorded marriage in the newly incorporated Paducah. By 1830, just 8 years after his arrival by canoe, Valentine started a much-needed ferry business to Illinois and bought up much acreage in Illinois. In 1831, he built a 3-story tavern and hotel. It was on the river where the flood wall is now located, across from Seamen's Institute. It literally caught the first rays of the sun, so he called it the Rising Sun. It was at that time the tallest building in Paducah. He continued to operate a ferry until his death in 1872. And according to census records in 1870, he had amassed a small fortune of $80,000. In 1872, he was like a multi-millionaire. Later, his family purchased an island at the confluence of the Ohio and Tennessee rivers, which became known as, you guessed it, Owen's Island. For my final story, I'm sure this is what you're all holding out for anyway, the one that you probably have heard the most about. Most Paducans have at least heard the story of Della Barnes and her grave at Oak Grove. Her legend has been passed from generation to generation, but let's separate the facts from the fiction. Della was born in Paducah in 1874 to Major George F. Burns and his wife Della. As mentioned before, Major Barnes was in charge of the burning of Lowertown after the Battle of Paducah. By the way, Major Barnes is also buried in the plot where Della is. However, he has no marker. Some say it's because he was a Yankee. Some say it's because he helped burn down Lowertown. And he also had an incident where he was so distressed over the death of Della that he took his own life. Here is Della's story, based on reports and information from the Paducah newspapers in 1897. Della's cousin, Clara Barnes, shared a room with her and was an eyewitness to Della's death. Clara stated that Della was feeling indisposed on that fateful night in June of 1897. She told Clara that she was going to take a dose of calomel. A little while later, she vomited the medicine and felt worse. She decided to take yet another dose before going to bed. Now, her mother was an invalid and would frequently have morphine on hand. The two medicines may have been stored together. From Clara's description given later on to the news, the medicine she saw Della take was clearly the morphine, and Della most likely got them mixed up. At 11 p.m., Clara was awakened by Della's strange breathing, and she thought she was having a nightmare. She tried to awaken her with no success. She called Della's parents, and they as well could not resuscitate her. A doctor was summoned, and he in turn called upon another doctor. The doctors did everything in their power to revive Della, but at 5:30 a.m., Della passed on in her family home at 1723 Jefferson Street. Now, these were the facts. Now, the fiction. Stories circulated that Della, engaged to a prominent Paducah man, was in love with another. Her fiancé was furious and demanded the ring back, which Della refused. So he cut it off her finger, also cutting the finger off itself, and she bled to death. That is pure fiction. Now, there's another story. Another story has her accidentally being poisoned by the doctor attending her. Again, fiction. Yet another story. In great despair over the loss of the two men, she committed suicide. Fiction. Her grieving father commissioned an Italian artist to create a life-size statue of Della holding a rose for her grave. Soon after, as legend goes, the ring finger fell off, and then blood was seen staining her hand and running down her dress. Through the years, vandals broke off more fingers, the hand, the head, the arms, and eventually everything above her waist was gone. Oak Grove had to finally remove the rest of the statue to prevent any more vandalism. Now, the only thing left is her torso and neck, which remain tucked away in the maintenance shed at the cemetery. So here they are. They still exist, but they're safe and sound. This prevents any more vandalism to take place. However, to this day, a shadow of the outline of the former statue can be seen burned into mausoleum behind Della's grave. Some say the shadow is a warning to future vandals. Della has reportedly been seen wandering the graveyard on the anniversary of her death, still carrying the red rose from the statue. Now, you've heard the facts and the fiction. You can draw your own conclusions. And speaking of conclusions, that concludes this. So now we're ready for the question time if anybody has any. And I'm going to leave this to Meredith to take over.
If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat, or you are able to unmute to ask them yourself. It looks like somebody wants to know if there are any Native Americans buried in the cemetery.
I have not found any Native Americans. Most all the Native Americans were gone from the Paducah area before Paducah was really settled, despite the Chief Paducah story. And by the way, when things clear up of everything going on in the world today, I love giving tours to Oak Grove, to groups. I don't charge anything. I just want to do it for fun. I enjoy doing it.
All right. Somebody asked, how long has Della Barnes' statue been gone?
I don't know that exactly, but I would say somewhere in the last 50 years or so, because we do have some color pictures of people standing by the statue yet, or part of it anyway. I've never seen it in place, only in the maintenance shed.
Somebody wanted to know what your contact information is for tours of Oak Grove, and I will type your email into the chat.
That's what it is, just my email.
royhensel@yahoo.com for anybody that can't see the chat.
And another thing, I don't know how many of you might be on a Facebook page called You Know You're from Paducah. I post lots of stories on there, especially famous, well, not famous, but interesting people from Paducah. A lot of them buried in Oak Grove, but not all of them are. Or it's just interesting stories of Paducah, which I have gathered through old newspapers and other sources, books, and so forth. Old newspapers are a great source. I'm using newspapers.com. So if anybody wants to read any of my stories, they can go on that site, type in my name on the search bar, and it'll turn up all my stories, including these. But I've kind of toned down these stories to make enough time to do all of them. Some of them are longer.
Someone wanted to know if you have done any research on people buried in Mountain Kenton Cemetery.
That would be Robert. Yeah, I have done some stories on Mount Kenton. There's a Jack Sleeth is buried here, who's considered to lay the first trans cable that went under the river in Paducah. A very sweet woman named Ma Little, which I did a story on, is buried there. There are several, of course, Alvin Barkley, but I mean, that goes without saying. And I'm working on that cemetery as well as the Jewish cemetery. I have found many interesting stories in the Jewish cemetery, which I'm going to try to start posting as well.
Do you do any other presentations like these?
Yes, I have. I've gone to groups, for example, and I've done a story of Abraham Lincoln, just using quotes from his life that he has said. And I actually become Abraham Lincoln when I'm doing the quotes. So I do that. I do a history of Lone Oak, which I take to the schools. I take to Lone Oak Intermediate School in 5th grade. And I do that each year. It's a really fascinating story of how Lone Oak started. And it was actually started by, yes, Dr. Pepper. That was his name. I'm working on a new history, a history of Reedland. That's still unfinished. So anybody has pictures of Reedland stores and things like that, I'd love to have them. I also have done a history of Paducah up until the Civil War. That I intend to take, again, when things clear up, to the Paducah City Schools, the 5th grade, so they can see that, as well as other groups if they need to. But I also have lots of pictures, and I've done a couple of presentations on the buildings of Paducah, both then and now, what they look like then and what was there then and what's there now, especially Broadway. In fact, I call my presentation, Give My Regards to Broadway.
All right, we have 2 questions. 3 questions. Have you considered writing a book on the cemeteries of Paducah?
Yeah, a lot of people have asked me that. I really have no idea. I could use the advice on how to do a book. I mean, I've got all this down on my computer. All these stories are on my computer, and to put them together would be pretty easy. I just don't know the how to do that type of thing to make it into a book and not lose a lot of money.
Okay. Have you ever been to Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville?
Yes, I have. I've seen George Rogers Clark there, Colonel Sanders. There's so many people. Muhammad Ali. Yes, it's a very fascinating place.
All right. The last one we have right now is, did the lynchings of African Americans in McCracken County take place before or after the lynching you mentioned?
First of all, the DeBeau was not a lynching. It was the actual legal hanging. And that's why I said, when I said the last legal hanging, I kind of did this because I have a feeling there were more after that, which were not exactly legal. Somebody has said that there was another legal hanging in Owensboro, but I haven't found that story yet. And I will say this while we're here for just a minute. Up till a little more than 2 years ago, I had no interest in Oak Grove Cemetery. I mean, not that I didn't have an interest in it, but I didn't know much about it. And when I started doing these tours with the Market House Theater, it made me really get interested in who else is buried here. These are interesting stories. And then about a year and a half ago, a friend of mine named Eric, you'll know who he is, challenged me. He said he had found a tombstone years ago when he was a youth that just said Edna on it. And could I find out what that was about? And as you see, I jumped into it and I found it. I love kind of being a detective and finding out the rest of the story, which I did. By the way, this past week, I have debunked or myth busted something else in Oak Grove. On Oak Grove's website, it says, and has been accepted for many years, Mary Haley is the oldest legible tombstone in Oak Grove. She died in April of 1841, and her grave was moved from where City Hall is now located. Since then, scouring the cemetery, I have found 4 graves older than hers, including one which is 6 years older than hers. And if somebody looks at the grave of the Revolutionary War soldier, Yule, that I mentioned, although he died in 1830, he wasn't, and his stone says that is not the original stone because his wife died in 1863. Then they made the stone and put it by his grave. So it takes a lot of research to figure all this out.
Speaking of research, somebody wants to know how you go about researching everything.
Well, I love to get leads, and every once in a while somebody will mention, have you heard about this person? Or something may lead to another thing. So the first thing I do, I have a newspapers.com subscription. First thing I do is type in that name and the Paducah area and a rough idea of the year or years. And usually I can find some things there, or that will lead me to something else. The internet has things too, but not like I can get from the newspapers. And the newspapers, however true their stories are, that's the ones I use mostly.
Any more questions? You're free to type them in the chat and I'll read them out for you, or you can unmute. Oh, somebody wants to know if that is a real skeleton behind you.
No, I didn't bring that from Oak Grove. No, my grandkids call him Bob Bones. So we dress him up each year. He has, I know you probably can't see it, but he has a shirt on, and it says, "Dearly Departed." That's a play I was in at the Market House Theater a couple of years ago. And I think it was very fitting for him to wear that, as well as the R.I.P. stone behind me. I decorate for Halloween a lot. I enjoy doing that. My grandkids love it too. But just this week, I learned about two sisters who were the last ones found in the flood, after the flood, and they were in their home 2 months dead. Sad case. I'm not going to tell too much because it's on our tour of Oak Grove for the Market House. But I did find out here. I was thinking all along, oh, these poor little old ladies, they died together, and holding hands in their bed and all like that. And then I came to find out, using newspapers.com, that one of the sisters was not that sweet, innocent little sister. She actually had been accused and sent to prison as an accomplice to a murder. She helped conspire a murder where somebody blew up somebody's house and did kill that woman in the house. So you never know what you're going to find. I don't want to tarnish the record of Major George Barnes, but he's already been tarnished anyway. But I found more research on another reason possibly why he took his own life, and it has to do with dealing with a lady of the night, so to say, who was his daughter's age after his daughter's death, and she had a child. But he took his life right before the child was born. So there's a lot of things that happen behind the stories.
All right. If there are no more questions, it's about time for us to end. I've typed Roy's contact information into the chat, but if you can't see it, it's royhensel@yahoo.com. That's where you can reach him if you have any additional questions. We're also going to be posting this up on our YouTube channel, so if you came in at a later part, you'll be able to see the entire recording. Roy, thank you very much for presenting with us. It was super interesting.
For those that joined me.